Welcome to the UK Finance webinar channel. My name is Oge Odensi. I'm a principal cybersecurity here at UK Finance. In today's session, in association with Citrix, we will discuss the very timely topic, is cyber the next business pandemic that will hit the banking industry? Joining me today, I am delighted to welcome a panel of experts for this discussion. In the room, I have Kurt Romer. Kurt is the Chief Security Strategist for Citrix. Hi, Kurt. It's lovely to have you on today.
Hi, Oge. Great to be here as well. Thanks.
I also have Katie Rigby-Brown. Katie is the Enterprise Relationship Manager, also at Citrix. And it's a pleasure to have you back here, Katie.
Thank you very much, Oge. Great to be here.
Just before I hand over to our speakers, I'd like to cover off a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar would last for 1 hour. We intend to present for 45 minutes and then answer your questions for the remaining 15 minutes. Within the auditorium, your media stream will appear on the left-hand side. You can resize the screen by clicking on the arrows located on the right of this window. At the bottom of the media stream window, you can also control the volume or access full screen view. If you are having any issues with accessing the media stream, please click on the Test Your Connection button or the Wi-Fi symbol at the bottom of the page. A note, Google Chrome or Firefox are our recommended browsers for watching the webinars, and having any other applications open, such as Teams, may disrupt your access. So we highly recommend that you close these where possible. For today, we have additional resources and documentation associated with our topic today, and you can find these under the resource tab in the auditorium. There's also a link to an evaluation survey in this area. We would greatly value any feedback you can provide us. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit this using the Q&A tool on the right side of the auditorium. We will try to answer these during the webinar, but if you do require a fuller answer or we run out of time, we will try to respond via email. We would also have contact details to Katie and Kurt, and so you can also reach out to them. Please note that when you ask a question, your name is not disclosed to other webinar attendees and you will be kept anonymous. I do recommend that you send your questions in at any point throughout the presentation and the Q&A session so you can get to the top of the line. Finally, if you're having technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool to contact the team at UK Finance. We are just in the background and we're here to help. It's my pleasure to hand over to Katie to introduce the topic and start the conversation. Over to you, Katie.
Brilliant, thank you. So if you could just, hopefully you should be seeing my screen around about now. And if you could let me know once my camera's back up only. Okay. Well, once again, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here with you again. As Oge said, I am an enterprise relationship manager at Citrix, so I look after 4 of our largest customers in the insurance, banking and capital markets sector, and I'm also the banking sector lead for the UK and Ireland. Now, earlier this year, we hosted a roundtable with leaders from across the sector to discuss the challenges that new ways of working were bringing and what that meant for the future of finance. And it was actually in that session that the title of today's webinar was born. Now, one of the positive side effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has really been to draw a line under the debate about home working. Now, notwithstanding the notably outspoken organisations, and they will remain nameless for today, who have made client-facing roles returning to the office mandatory, the financial services sector has, on the whole, embraced hybrid work. But that doesn't change the fact that there is no doubt that there are serious challenges if a home office or hybrid is to become the norm, at least not where security and really the foundation of financial services, so trust, are concerned. So one of the questions I'd invite you to think about over the course of the next 45 minutes is, how do you make sure that a work from anywhere policy doesn't translate into get hacked from anywhere? Now, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the annual Verizon Business Data Breach Investigation Report, or the DBIR. Their 2020 survey highlighted a significant scaling up of cyber threats across the board, with credential theft and social attacks such as phishing and business email compromises that cause over 67% of all breaches. And at the same time, web application breaches doubled. Now, the fact that you've joined us today means that you are likely already faced with the spectrum of challenges that are faced, that are brought in by cybersecurity challenges, and the solutions already available to businesses to secure critical assets for your remote workers. You may also even be aware of the speed at which they, like the number and nature of attacks, are evolving. The purpose of the next 45 minutes is for us to share with you what we're hearing from your peers, how banking sector trends are intersecting with broader trends in the technology sector, and how you can put the right controls in place to manage your distributed workforce without interrupting their ability to work. Now, even pre-pandemic, financial services firms were more likely than other institutions to be attacked or experience cyber attacks. Now, this is based on research done by Boston Consulting Group right at the end of 2019, so just before COVID hit. And that actually puts it as 300 times more likely than other industries. And I'm sure a number of you recall, if not personally, but as a customer, the 2018 attacks that forced 7 of the UK's largest banks either to reduce operations or shut them down completely. Now, if we fast forward to today, so that's some two years later, or 3 years from the 2018 attack, into what I'm calling a post-pandemic way of thinking for work. So in no way am I suggesting that we're out of the pandemic, but from a new ways of working, we accept that the world has changed. And we all know now that, our staff need to access and communicate data beyond the periphery of the usual security firewalls. So this concept of the traditional castle and moat approach that's employed in the office is no longer applicable. And it's imperative that all egress and ingress points are identified and secured in newly expanded networks. Because from now on, in fact, actually for most of the pandemic, cybersecurity is increasingly residing as much with the individual as it is with the environment. At the same time as that's happening, what we're hearing from you and from your peers is that you are accelerating the pace at which you're delivering a consumer-like experience for your end users in the workplace. So almost like an Amazon-like experience from end user experience. And I think in this context, it's important to remember a couple of things. Now, first of all, security breaches are often the result of things done in the search of ease or speed. So historically, we've talked about shadow IT purchases, but it doesn't even need to be anything that involves a financial transaction. It could be posting things in unsanctioned servers or cloud storage accounts, or even more emailing corporate information to home accounts to print on a wireless printer. So one thing is certain, that as you accelerate your digitalization journey, that has to be accompanied by a corresponding security transformation. Now, the Bank of England are certainly making it loud and clear that they see cybersecurity as a huge threat to the industry. Now, they're doing that in a couple of ways, and I'm sure some of you are already, if not many of you, involved in responding to the March 2020 deadline for financial services firms to deliver a detailed plan on how you would handle a cyber attack. But more recently, their cybersecurity war games, which has actually opened up to over 150 firms, making it the largest exercise of its kind, is also opening remotely. So that means that those teams participating can choose to complete the exercises from a location of their choice. Again, I see this as a nod to the ubiquity of remote work. And those teams participating will be confronted with an evolving event that starts with a notification that systems have been compromised, and then spirals to them not being able to access data or communicate with their employees, ultimately running the business. Now, the project, if you're not involved in it, is overseen by the Cross-Market Operational Resilience Group, which is in fact co-chaired by UK Finance and the Bank of England. And certainly from a Citrix perspective, and looking at my own customer base, I'm really interested to see what is shared from this to those of us who are third parties, and how the role of critical third parties are addressed alongside insider threats and bad actors. At the start of the webinar, I talked about the intersection between technology trends and those in the banking sector. So let's look for a moment at the transition to cloud and SaaS. Now, on the whole, what we're seeing is that as financial services organizations, you are fast to acquire and adopt net new cloud services, but, and not unexpectedly, slower to transition your legacy applications from on-premises to the cloud. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and the risks associated with that over the course of the next 45 minutes. Now, hybrid work is the way of working, irrespective of your organization or whether you have specific policies that dictate days and times. I think we're all agreed that a full return to the office is unlikely for most of us. But what we're hearing now, certainly from your peers, is that while moving everyone from the office to a fixed location, so i.e. home working, I'm in fact speaking to you from my home office today, was on the whole delivered seamlessly, how to manage the experience of users moving between networks, across different authentication routes, across devices, is proving significantly more challenging, both from a security perspective, but also in terms of understanding how you manage the budget constraints of multiple different devices. And of course, underpinning this is security, not just for remote workers, but again, bringing up the topic of the third parties in your wider supply chain. And the reality is that the traditional IT approaches were not built with these challenges in mind. And with that, it's not surprising to see that every aspect of your business is susceptible to a cyber attack, with many of the attacks being deployed at the same time. So whether you're thinking about your users, the devices those users are accessing, the network that those devices are connected to, or networks. In fact, this morning I read a very interesting article about the threat of some new Internet of Things devices in people's homes. So whether that's a smart fridge, whether it's a Hive or whatever else that you are connecting, and the impact that's now having on corporate networks. Ultimately, the end goal is obviously to get to data. Now, the average ransomware payment climbed over 80% in the first half of 2021 when you compare it to 2020, as criminals are employing increasingly aggressive tactics. Now, whether it's encrypting your data and seeking then finance to release that, whether it's data theft or denial of service, these are increasing weekly, daily, and monthly. And of course, it's not just your every aspect of your business that's susceptible, but every organization. And as we tend to see, cyber attacks are geographic in their nature. The series that targeted Swiss companies over the summer continued, with Zurich falling victim to hackers in mid-August. Now, while Zurich emphasized that they complied with all of their legal and regulatory requirements, what I wanted to call out is this is a real growing example of the threat of hacktivism, and where the risk of reputational damage remains high, regardless of whether the breach has been contained by you and properly reported. And then, of course, in March, the EBA took all of its systems offline after being hit by the cyber attack that certainly wasn't just targeting the industry. It was industry agnostic, but was susceptible for every on-premise version of Microsoft Exchange. And if you just think back to the comment I made there about financial services as a whole being slower to adapt from on-premises to cloud for some of the legacy systems, this really highlights, just as COVID did with lack of scalability, the challenges of still being on premises versus being in the cloud in terms of having latest software updates, latest patches, and security releases. So we're going to move now to an audience question.
Thank you very much, Katie. And just calling out that Citrix has certainly made a difference in a lot of organizations, especially within the financial sector, more so during the pandemic. And the move to remote working, and now, like you've mentioned, the forward look at hybrid work environments and what that looks like. And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from a security standpoint, what's happening within Citrix, how you are looking at cybersecurity as you continue to evolve and as organizations continue to champion hybrid working environments. Right now, starting with the poll, for our audience on the webinar today, I'd like to ask a question. And for our first poll, there will be two questions that precede the first. That will precede the first one. Now, my first question is: how are you reallocating your cybersecurity resources in 2022? We're looking at: are you moving to EDR? Are you looking at an SASC model? Or are you moving to cloud-hosted desktops? I'll give it a moment for the poll to be successfully asked and for results to come in from the crowd, from the group today. Okay, some very interesting result here. And Kurt, and maybe you can give us an insight on this. A lot of people, 83.3% so far, has said they are moving to EDR. What are your thoughts on that? And is this something that you expect within the industry?
Yeah, definitely not surprising results within financial services. I think when you look at endpoint detection and response, it's really perpetuating a lot of the traditional model of corporate-owned devices, laptops, desktops, et cetera, and really probably looking at that as a return to office in many cases. When you take a look at people continuing to work from home or work in a hybrid model, definitely make sure that your EDR picture plays out and works in each of the different situations that people will be working from, including BYO. And as we're also asking, are you doing something different for your third parties, for people who don't have corporate managed systems? You know, EDR is fantastic. It's being rolled out in a lot of places, but realize a couple of the boundary conditions where EDR might be supplemented. And that's where, you know, looking at a SASE model, it's a Gartner term, Secure Access Service Edge. Basically what that's doing is it's taking all of the protections of the corporate network that you might have left behind as you left the office or as you left the corporate VPN, and it's combining those with cloud-delivered threat management and intelligence, and being able to protect not just a single laptop or desktop, but really anything on the local network. So if you've got printers and you've got other devices that are critical to you, this way all those devices can be protected. And we'll talk about some additional use cases for that. Cloud-hosted desktops, and I would say as well, cloud-hosted browsers, and just browser sandboxing in general is also a very big topic these days, especially as a lot of companies move to more SaaS-based environments. So make sure whatever you're doing from an endpoint protection perspective also covers local browsers, containerized browsers, cloud-hosted browsers, and other models. Revisiting your enterprise browser strategy going into 2022 is going to be absolutely essential.
Thanks very much, Kurt. And as an update to the poll results, now we have 69% saying they are moving to EDR and 30% saying they are moving to the SASE model. But we do not have any responses on moving to cloud-hosted desktops. And as we progress in the conversation, it'll be good to find out why, and if so, why not? Moving into the next poll question. I've now asked the poll to audience, and the question is, are you using a different cybersecurity model for third parties and your supply chain? And again, this is a simple yes or no answer. It would be good to hear from Kurt after the results are read, of course, why the yes or no answer and what that means if you are or you are not using a different cybersecurity model. All right, we're starting to get some responses. So far, we have 71% saying no, and only 28% saying yes. Any thoughts from that?
Yeah, those are very surprising results to me. And what we're typically seeing with third party and supply chain is a lot of the connectivity is through devices and networks that are not managed by the entity that you're connecting to. And so when you have a bank that has a third party connecting in, typically you don't have the ability to manage the endpoint. And so what we're seeing many other organizations do is embrace a zero trust model, really saying that all trust must be earned. And so instead of providing connectivity directly into the network or providing connectivity directly to applications, which oftentimes you have to do in a SaaS model, you're embracing the principles of zero trust and just making sure that everything is being completely verified. So it'd be interesting as we take a look at people who are saying they're not doing something different from a cybersecurity model. Are you considering zero trust being a core part of that cybersecurity model? I know we haven't had that conversation yet, but it'll be really interesting moving forward, and love to hear from you in the chat. Can you expand a little bit on your answer and any unmet needs there? Thanks.
Thanks, Kurt. I definitely agree with you. It would be great to hear from our audience in the chat, either in a question or comment as to why there is a no on our question poll too. I would now hand it back to Katie to carry on with the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, and definitely as we take a look at 2022, I think it's definitely wise to plan for continued disruption. And Katie and I are going to talk about that in several different areas. So as you take a look at what's up on the screen, these are many areas of disruption that can be happening. And remember, disruption is happening from an application perspective. We're seeing a lot more cloud and SaaS hosted applications. It's definitely being an issue from a device perspective, and with continued work from home, there seems to be a continued expansion of BYO devices and therefore unmanaged devices. But people are also adopting new ways of working, and we're seeing a lot of work models integrated into workspaces, into frameworks, into portals, and it's really driving some different ways to be able to secure not only our data, but also our content. I mean, think of a lot of the critical conversations that are being moved to Teams and Slack and Zoom and others, non-traditional data. This content still contains very, very sensitive data, and many times it may also be voice analyzed and in other ways utilized by the organization. So how are you providing for the security and privacy aspects of those particular data types and of that content? And we also have, consumerization driving a lot of simplification within enterprise environments, and consumers definitely demanding that they receive an experience that is something they're used to as they work from home and as they've been working during the pandemic. And as they go into a return from office situation, how are they going to continue to have that experience? A couple things to think about as we go through and talk about disruption. If you were to step back from a business perspective and say, hey, I was going to just come out with a new startup that was going to completely disrupt our industry, and you were to pick 3 items on this chart that would be core elements of that disruption, what would they be and why? And that can help to drive a lot of your strategy going into 2022, understanding where others might be disrupting your model and where you have some opportunity there as well. Right, Katie?
Absolutely. And Kurt, I'd be really interested to see if we've got, or what responses we've got in the chat from the audience on this. Certainly, 4 or 5 years ago, fintech and insurtech were talked about as competitors to the market space. And typically what we're seeing now, with a couple of exceptions, is that they are working hand in glove. And we'll talk more about open banking and APIs over the course of the webinar. But I think when we're looking at competition and regulatory, we talked about it earlier, there is more and more focus on how organizations are going to manage their APIs, how they're going to manage their third parties, and actually how the integration and marketplace of finance or banking as a service, the impact that's having both for consumers, but also on IT organizations' operations. We're also seeing some huge announcements from players like Deutsche Bank announcing big partnerships with Google and looking at what they're going to do with AI and machine learning. So this is all impacting, again, not only the delivery of service and value that's being delivered out to the marketplace, but the core operational models of our customers.
And I think from my perspective, as we talk to executives throughout the world, really one of the core themes is agility. Business needs to move much faster, and IT needs to be able to move much faster to be able to react at the speed of business. And with that, as we talk about this disruption, 2 of the trends that Katie and I wanted to highlight and bring to the forefront, number 1 of which is experience, and that's optimization for performance and many other aspects. And when you look at experience across the organization, I tend to define experience as a balance of security, productivity, and cost. When you blend those together, you're making a conscious decision so that in different situations, you've got the right experience or balance of security, productivity, and cost. As someone goes from being a normal worker to being an administrator, as they go from just reading corporate email to working with a high-value card member or other customer. There are many situations where somebody's transitioning between devices, where they're transitioning between locations, where they're transitioning between roles and responsibilities. And as you look at those transitions, that experience needs to change. And so when we talk about experience, it's something we not only need to be able to gauge and measure and report on, but it's also something we need to be able to actively manage. And so that's one of the big takeaways in terms of planning for disruption in 2022 is to be able to manage your experience, that balance of security, productivity, and cost in everything you do across situations. And that helps embrace the principle of zero trust, making sure that everything we do after we've declared a state of zero trust is continuously situationally aware and contextually risk appropriate. Highly, highly important. And we'd love to talk to you about that further. Going along with that is really the second big area of disruption that I see, and that's helping to make sure that we're amplifying the efforts of our IT administrative staff. If you look across the world, you see so many people who are having issues with finding qualified staff as people have worked from home, as people are leaving the workforce. And you look at something called the Great Resignation, where it's estimated that a 40% of U.S. knowledge workers have left at least one job or are planning to in the last year. And with that, 53% of them actually took a pay cut. 60% of them are looking at joining startups or have joined startups. Those are some pretty big numbers, and those are definitely affecting banking and finance across the world as the competition for talent, particularly in the IT and security space, has amplified tremendously. So we have to make sure that we're concentrating not just on employee experience, but we're also providing for a very superior IT experience and security experience so that we've got really strong reasons for those critical staff to be able to remain within our employ. Katie, other thoughts on that?
I think you've raised some really valid points there about the war on talent, and certainly we're seeing the biggest increase in new hires being in the IT and developer spaces that are already highly attractive, again, in the startup area. I think if I look specifically at this slide, though, a lot of the topics that we saw as key at the start of this year, particularly in banks and building societies, was the concept of the reimagining of the branch. And I know we're going to move on to talk about ransomware in a moment, but I think when we think about employee and frictionless experience and utilizing the investment we've already got, how can you enable and free up those employees to move around, whether it's your branch or your offices? So perhaps staff who are multi-skilled, who could perform multiple roles for your customers, can do that without the constraints that they have today of various different devices.
And as we take a look at ransomware, definitely no surprise that we've seen a tremendous increase in ransomware attacks, having them skyrocket 150% in 2020, and estimated that a ransomware attack is occurring every 11 seconds here in 2021. Those are amazing statistics. There's also some really big cost back behind this as well. And you look at the global cost associated with ransomware, it's estimated to exceed 20 billion US here in 2021. That's a real cost to the business. And ransomware is definitely being pervasive for a lot of different reasons. Oftentimes in the past, there was a lot of focus on employee education and awareness and making sure that people weren't clicking on links or opening up attachments that were coming in that they didn't know who they were from. Ransomware, however, has evolved so that it doesn't require user action or inaction in a lot of cases, and it's taking advantage of vulnerabilities. And so you might have a vulnerability that's been patched last night. The ransomware actors have already been working on this. They already have ransomware targeted for that. And if you have not applied that patch, your organization is at risk. So one of the big things from a ransomware perspective here going into 2022 is, now that the patch cycle has been reduced to near zero, how can you make sure that you're keeping up with that? Do you have the infrastructure in the platform so that you can have critical patches or workarounds or compensating controls available as soon as this threat emerges? And that's been a big challenge in the past because patching, of course, is a lot of work and takes a lot of time and takes a lot of bandwidth. So take a look at some ways that you can help to reduce your patch cycles appropriately, but you probably need to think of something very innovative and not just trying to incrementally change past practices here. It's been a very common theme with organizations that we've been talking to. Another big aspect of ransomware that I'd like you to think about going into 2022 is how can you manage ransomware as a project, looking at it from readiness all the way through to response, and making sure that you have teams engaged with shared responsibilities, with handoffs, with boundaries, and that's automated as part of your platform. So that if you do have an event, even if it's an attack that didn't lead to anything substantial, you still have a way to respond to that, to report on it, to get mitigations in place for the rest of the organization. But if you have something that's a little more pervasive, you also have a plan that is put in place, that's tested, that's ready, and that is something that you can engage in an automated fashion to make sure that people are kept up to date, that reports are being put out, and that automatic patching and updates and your escalation plan is being affected. Definitely something we'd like to talk to you about further. Ransomware unfortunately is not going away, so we've got to make sure that we're looking at it both from a readiness as well as a response perspective and everywhere in between. So if you're interested in seeing more of that ransomware mitigation framework, we're happy to share that with you. Just drop us a note. And definitely a lot that we can do together here, a lot of information sharing, and making sure that we're planning for the future of ransomware is absolutely going to be critical to the financial industry.
Thank you very much, Kurt. It's you are correct. Ransomware is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And the financial sector, of course, is not exempt from this. I mean, we have seen that while there isn't a specific target on the financial sector, or there could be, we still see the impact or the potential impact on the sector. And even more so recently, the regulators and the government in the UK and even EU and US have started to focus in on ransomware and what can we do here, what's our response here. So this is a very timely discussion, and the importance of readiness and mitigation cannot be overstated. So thank you for mentioning that. And I think we are going next into our next poll, if I'm correct. And I have now asked our audience the question. Now, the question that we're asking here is, as you were planning for disruption in 2022, what are some of the additional concerns or mitigations that you're experiencing? And options are open banking, greater use of APIs, hybrid work, and micro branches. I'll give it a few more seconds before I start to talk about the results that we are receiving.
And I think, okay, it's probably worth us calling out here for anyone that is certain of the definition between the two. Open banking, we're obviously talking about your external collaboration, and then the greater use of APIs would be more for your internal users.
Thanks for that clarification. And while we wait for poll results to come in, I'd like to encourage the audience to please send in their questions. We do want to make sure that Citrix, as we have them on the webinar today, will answer any of the questions that you may have on the topic that we're speaking on today. Thank you. All right, I think we've got a good amount of responses, and so 44% of our responses said hybrid work and micro branches. Another 44% said greater use of APIs, and 11% said open banking. Kurt, Katie, any comment or input on the results?
So I think, Kurt, I'll take that, and it's actually kind of a nice segue into our next section on open banking. I think, it's been 3 years now since PSD2 came into force, and while globally it hasn't been the big, I suppose, the big adoption that people had expected, the UK is actually leading the charge in adoption. I think some of those results there kind of maybe let us see that there's a bit of a tail off in seeing the benefit of open banking. Kurt, I'm not sure if you've got thoughts there on greater use of APIs and then the impact that that's going to have for people on looking at how to reduce API attacks.
Yeah, we're seeing API attacks escalating tremendously. And actually, as you take a look at most applications being dynamically assembled by APIs in terms of forward-looking frameworks, most of the industry analyst pundits are saying that the attacks are moving to the API layer. And so we've talked about ransomware, we've talked about other forms of a cyber attack. Expect those to be targeting your APIs. And so having visibility at the API level on the attacks that are being executed against those, what shadow APIs are being used, in other words, unsanctioned APIs that might be used as part of existing applications, as part of frameworks, as part of development environments. We need to have visibility into that across the organization so that you can have that as part of your overall risk framework. And it's really understanding that the API economy moving forward and a lot of APIs being external to the organization can directly bring in risk that you otherwise would not have visibility into unless you have specific API security measures. So having an API gateway, API firewall, having API visibility and reporting for your developers, for IT, for the security department, as well as just helping your lines of business to understand how API usage is escalating within the organization and what the risk framework looks like with that. Many are looking at APIs as just being something that you express or consume. They're part of an open framework or something that's just being utilized by developers. APIs are absolutely core to business these days, and I think there's a lot more information that needs to be disseminated across lines of business so that they understand the use of APIs, the strategic nature of these, but also the cyber attacks that can leave the business exposed.
Kurt, I think there's a perception or perhaps a misconception that APIs are really the domain of IT. As an organization, looking at how much APIs are being increased both internally to reduce some manual processes, but also externally with the adoption of open banking, really who's responsible for knowing what the posture on APIs is? You just talked about having a specific security posture for APIs, which are likely going to be with third parties.
Yeah, it's a great point, Katie, because depending on your position in the organization, you're going to see API responsibility in different areas. You might see it as externally if you're interfacing with APIs for interoperability between different organizations or services that you consume for processing credit cards and other transactions. You might see API responsibility being part of your developers as they're developing in-house applications or doing integrations. IT might be responsible for overall API risk, but IT is also responsible for the infrastructure use of APIs. And we're seeing the rise of APIs in terms of infrastructure for provisioning environments, for HR onboarding and offboarding, for automation of infrastructure, and even automation of application rollout and transitions within the organization. We're seeing that escalate tremendously. But oftentimes, these automation frameworks are done just in scripts that are utilizing APIs, and they're not done in an overall framework of what is the overall API risk to the organization. And so this is why going into 2022, it's a really great idea to get your handle around APIs from all of those different perspectives, from the external consumption of APIs, from your development, but also looking at it from an IT and compliance, visibility and risk, as well as infrastructure. Those are all separate areas, but they can all be utilizing very similar APIs, and oftentimes we'll be combining APIs that will provide for very unique risks.
Thank you, Kurt.
Yeah, and you've highlighted here on this slide some of the risks that I've been referring to in terms of API usage, and definitely the opportunity for DDoS, distributed denial of service, from an API perspective. Can your APIs handle abuse? And Do you even know what APIs are being used within the organization? And if there are unsanctioned or shadow APIs that are being utilized for whatever reason, do you understand where they're being used, when they came in, and whether this is something that was a planned part of your development environment or something that just snuck in as somebody is doing some espionage against the organization? And because of the ubiquitous usage of APIs and all the different data that they can access and modify, of course, they can be a tremendous vector for breaches. So if you haven't done pen testing at the API level and really stepped up your application security to focus on APIs, definitely an area to bring to the forefront here in 2022 and prepare the organization, including the board, for APIs being a significant part of the security discussion going forward. And I guess getting into a little further information on some of the APIs, many are going against backend databases, and so our old friends of SQL injection and command injection, even from a PowerShell scripting and other perspective, definitely comes into play. Talked about DDoS and APIs. When you take a look at shopping carts and you take a look at authentication, you take a look at other layers, a DDoS attack would be absolutely devastating if it was targeted to keep all of your employees from logging in the morning or keep all of your customers from checking their balance in the afternoon. And those are real possibilities right now, unfortunately, in many organizations. Looking at API interoperability from an authentication perspective, many organizations are relying on single sign-on these days, and a lot of the interoperability between different authentication layers, tremendous, really helps to enhance the experience, but also make sure that once an attack comes in, it can be a lot more pervasive. And so look at that not only from an employee experience perspective, from an authentication perspective, but definitely look at it from the perspective of your privileged workers and your administrative workers. If somebody were to abuse an administrative API or a privileged API, they could probably go through the organization as a malicious actor in ways that others could not. And oftentimes, it might not even be visible, especially if this is abusing a script that has been automated with back-end system calls. There are just so many things going on with APIs and automation that are happening behind the scenes that we need visibility into.
And Oge, before we move to our final audience question, would really be great to get some insight from you as UK Finance as to, we talked a little bit about ransomware, we've talked about DDoS attacks. Are you seeing a lot of inquiries from your members around APIs, both from an open banking or just actually being used internally, and concern about how to manage that?
We are definitely seeing from a broader digital innovation standpoint and how technology continues to, of course, evolve within the landscape. And when we talk about the APIs, I think a lot of the conversation is happening within the cloud space as well. And so how do we ensure that the security, not just on-prem, but also on cloud, and how do we ensure that legacy systems, and the connectivity across on-prem and on cloud services and environments is seamless, and the security is maintained and resilience within that space. So we are seeing specific questions come out of that broader adoption standpoint across the digital innovation landscape, of course.
Thank you. It's interesting you should say that, because we're, again, depending on the nature of the organization, hearing quite mixed messages about cloud adoption recently, with some organizations saying that actually to maintain security and compliance requirements, moving to the cloud was really the driving factor. And with others saying, particularly with some heritage applications, that they're just not ready to move, actually security concerns were the reason for them staying on premises. So that's some interesting feedback.
Yeah, and I'd like to encourage our audience as well. If you have any further points on what you're seeing within your organization with regards to APIs and security challenges, of course, you come in as anonymous, like I mentioned. Please do comment and ask your question. Now, moving into our final poll question, and before we allow for audience questions, I would like to ask, what are the biggest challenges in managing cybersecurity risks as you establish your hybrid work model? Some of our options are too many applications or vendors to manage, lack of actionable data, no single view, insufficient knowledge of entitlement already held. I will allow for a minute or so for responses to come in. But repeating the options we have. So we have 1, too many applications or vendors to manage. 2, lack of actionable data. 3, no single view. And 4, insufficient knowledge of entitlement already held. As results come in, we have 62% of our audience so far saying too many applications and vendors to manage. And we have 37% saying no single view. I do expect that this would evolve as responses continue to come in. But in a lot of ways, 66%, the 33% who are saying too many applications and vendors to manage, that has flipped, hasn't it? I agree with that in a lot of ways because this is what we're seeing in the industry. One of the concerns is, we have too many suppliers and too many vendors, and we are asked by the regulators to identify what's material and critical to us. And getting that view of all of your suppliers and all of your vendors continues to be a big challenge within the sector. Passing it back to you, Katie and Kurt, to conclude the last part of our presentation before we move to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, again. I think, there was, we deliberately put the no single view and the too many vendors there as 2 separate options, or I think probably they're actually the same answer, right? If you've got no single view, it suggests you probably have too many vendors. And that's really what we're hearing from most of our customers today. It's that I know I'm managing certain aspects of cyber. In fact, I've got so many programs that overlap, but actually I was surprised not to see more responses. And Kurt, be interested to get your view on this, on no actionable data, because one of the things we're hearing a lot of the times is we've acquired something that has entitlement to do a portion of something, or we've got several different teams running this, but there's no overlap of what they're doing. So that goes back to the no single view. But perhaps most damaging is we've got all of these tools, but they don't actually tell us what to do with the information. So we can produce a nice report and tell you exactly what the problems were last month, but nothing's telling us what we need to do right now. Kurt, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, really, as we take a look at that, I think the call for integration is absolutely essential. And we talked about employee experience and administrative experience. When you look at your organization and you think about what the average worker utilizes in terms of numbers of applications per week, usually that's in the dozens. And when you take a look at what the average administrator uses, that can be 30 or more applications and tools per week. Those are all separate application experiences and all areas where somebody has to stop and think about how to do something differently. And so it disrupts their work. But then on the back end, there's also costs associated with maintaining all of those different relationships and being able to maintain the integrations. So really moving forward, to have the agility, it's to have the integration, to have the unified views, and to be able to perform IT rationalization with real information, knowing how applications are utilized across the organization. So you've got that telemetry, not just on whether somebody opened an application or not, but what was their meaningful use within that application? How much time did they spend in it? Is this something that, could be done in a different way? And so having that visibility is going to be absolutely essential so that we can manage the disruption and be able to continue to internally disrupt ourselves as organizations so that we've got superior operational efficiency. And,
I think just on the kind of survey results there, what we're seeing is what we're hearing from your peers is not that dissimilar to what's come out of the survey, with really the top control being we have so much data, but I don't know where to start with it. And just before we get to the Q&A, I think, you said something really interesting, kind of near to the start, Oge, about Citrix and understanding more about the role and the value we've provided to customers in the pandemic for remote work. So apologies for calling that out, but I think actually it kind of lends quite nicely to the use case that we'd like to share with you just before we move to Q&A. Now, I mentioned right at the start that I joined Citrix just before the pandemic, so in January of 2020. And I think we're very well known for how we have helped deliver virtual applications and virtual desktops. But when we're talking about actually vendor consolidation and the criticality of understanding what a vendor delivers to you and the value they can add, I think Citrix is often thought about only from a virtualization standpoint. Now, in the last year, we've really seen, unsurprisingly, you will have seen this as well, an increase in customers building out their zero trust policies to prevent that work from anywhere, get hacked from anywhere risk that I talked about. Now, one example that I've got up on the screen to share with you today is actually a UK insurer who has known Citrix traditionally from that virtualization space, but during the pandemic, in their response, issued a number of devices to remote workers. Now, they implemented at the time what they thought was a fit for purpose for them, secure internet access solution that allowed them to deliver applications securely without virtualizing them. As time went on, they hadn't realized it wasn't going to be compatible for all of their users, many of whom were using Chromebooks. And actually, those Chromebook users were traditionally how they delivered their call center and chat agents. And it was actually through one of our business reviews with them that during the conversation that started again in the virtualization space and what we do as a provider, that they understood that this was a problem we could help them with. So, when we're talking about understanding the number of vendors, the criticality and the support they can provide you, I think it's important for us to sort of talk about here what we can do to help support things like a broader OS coverage from a secure internet access perspective, delivering actionable insights around DLP and more than just simple alerts, and put containerization in place so that there's a greater level of granular security. And with that, what I'm saying is we're seeing more and more customers now move away from virtualization as the route to everything, but actually Citrix, how can you help me secure either my endpoint or how I'm accessing applications? And in fact, we've recently launched a new service around application security, which I know Kirk can talk more about, because we're really seeing that application experience here has become a currency in business, and it's no longer about going to a desktop and launching a start menu. It's actually about how do we deliver the greatest experience in the right way and the right moment for the application.
Yeah, when you think about providing security as a service, there's a lot of great reasons for that, because you're getting information from many different sources, and being able to provide that through the cloud is going to give the best experience to the workforce throughout the world, as well as working with your third parties. And I think that's one of the big takeaways in terms of planning for next year is where can you leverage a lot of security as a service to give you visibility and control as we continue to be in this hybrid model, as supply chain security continues to be front of mind with attacks and results. And as we take a look at continuing to distribute work between applications that are very geographically diverse. So these models can include the SASE model in terms of security at the edge, of course, EDR, which we've talked about a little bit, as well as a lot of the cloud-based services that drive back-end infrastructures, bringing together a lot of the authentication capabilities, bringing together a lot of the web application firewall capabilities, API management and visibility, and taking a look at providing these as cloud services that can really be consumed with any model. And as Katie mentioned, from Chromebooks all the way up to fully managed Windows corporate managed laptops and BYO devices.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And thank you also, Katie, for today. This has been a really insightful discussion. In the last sort of 7 minutes that we have left, I'd like to ask you some questions that we have received from the audience. And the first question would be, what do you envisage to be the main cyber concerns for the UK banking industry in 2022? I mean, we have already talked about a few of those on the call today and in the poll questions. But what more do you think is coming on the landscape, and how do you think that's going to happen within the banking sector?
Yeah, from a technical perspective, I'll go ahead and answer, and then Katie can handle a business perspective on this. Technically, we've talked a lot about API security and how APIs are coming to the forefront, and I see that as being a very strong cyber attack vector moving forward. And seeing things like ransomware move to the API layer as well. Really, the big mitigations for organizations are to take a look at API security across infrastructure, across development, and across your third-party integrations, and make sure that you've got unified visibility and response there so that the organization can respond as a whole and not in pockets as it might be today, or silos, if you will. Katie, how about from a business perspective? What are the biggest threats you see going into 2022?
I mean, what I'm typically hearing, and again, this is predominantly in the banking and capital market space, is first of all, how do we ensure that this doesn't impact our digitalization journey? And some of that comes back to the things we've talked about in terms of having too many suppliers and not a great view. I think, we're seeing a huge acceleration to the cloud. We're seeing huge divestment in businesses that were no longer profitable, and organizations focus on core business areas. But there's this concern here that there is an increasing spend and requirement in cyber, and that perhaps not the number of talent professionals that are required to deliver that internally. So, the biggest challenge is, how do I manage it better and make it more simple? And how do I make sure it doesn't impact the digitalization journey that we're going on and that's crucial to the success of our business?
Thank you very much. That's very appreciated. And I think this also links into the next question that I've got coming here now. And you mentioning APIs as sort of what we're anticipating in the landscape now and looking into 2022. So just coming back to you, Katie, with an increased use of APIs, what should we then be asking our developers, and what should the banking sector and the financial sector at large be asking our developers with regards to APIs?
Kurt, would you like to take that?
Sure. It's making sure that you've got an API inventory and you're taking a look at APIs as cyber assets that are absolutely essential to the operation of the business. And so as you would track other assets, taking a look at how they're being introduced to the organization, how they're being managed through their life cycle, and how they're being deprecated as APIs are retired and moved on. Making sure that you've got that life cycle process for visibility of APIs, for management of APIs, for security, as well as for response if there are security concerns. So from a developer perspective, which API frameworks are they utilizing? Which ones are they moving towards? Which APIs have they designed themselves versus which ones are being consumed externally? And particularly from an integration perspective, who are we integrating with, and what are some of the API security requirements that are being asked of us as we integrate with third parties? That's a great place to start, and then definitely combine that with IT infrastructure requirements for APIs.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I appreciate that response. And we are only able to take one more question. And again, this follows on from what your response has been with regards to what should we be asking our developers. The second question on APIs is who then within our organization should know what's going on with APIs. And we have talked about this within the financial sector over and over. It's not just about your IT. Technology is becoming such a fundamental part of how we do business that business resilience, operational resilience, they're all interconnected. So the question is for you then: who should know about this in the organization and why?
Really, anybody who manages cyber risk should be aware of APIs. So the governance organization, the legal organization, there definitely needs to be some board level visibility into the rise of APIs as well, including IT and your developers. There are just so many places within the organization that APIs are absolutely essential to secured operations. It's no one particular group. IT definitely, though, can lead the charge in terms of providing for tools and providing for a visibility environment to ensure that you've got substantial API security.
Thank you very much. And in the last minute that we have with you all today, I'd like to thank you, Katie and Kurt, for joining us today. And I'd like to also thank our audience, and thanks especially for all of your questions. I hope you can join us for our next webinar, which takes place on the 27th of October with Confirmation. They are a part of Thomson Reuters. And here we'll be discussing letting go of legacy IT systems in 2021. Any last words from you, Katie and Kurt, before we end today?
No, just thank you for having us again today, and it's been a pleasure to talk to the audience. Any questions, please reach out to Oge and get our contact details.
And thank you, everyone. Let's collaborate and continue the discussion. Security is all of our responsibility, and look forward to working together with you.
Thank you all, and goodbye.